Hello everyone. This recording is being done after our Sunday celebration. The talk failed to record at the Sunday celebration, so this is being recorded afterwards so that everyone can hear it. So if you are listening again and you were there on the Sunday, you might notice it's slightly different, but hopefully it's going to be pretty much the same thing as everyone heard on that Sunday. We're really excited to be gathering together to go through our sermon series as we continue with that, our sermon series on the heart of prayer and worship. And over these weeks, we're looking at how we posture and shape our hearts rightly towards God in and through prayer and worship as we look at the attitude of our hearts. Because hopefully we want to know God and love God with greater intensity and intimacy, and worship him both individually and together as a church, as a community, not out of duty, but to glorify him and to align our hearts with his will and his plans. And each week as we go through this series, we're looking at the Psalms where prayer and worship go together hand in hand, and we're looking at David in the Psalms. David's described as a man after God's own heart, and so we are looking at this as we want to be a church that is after God's own heart. And as we look at these Psalms and prayers of David, we're seeking what they reveal about the posture of David's heart for God, and then other biblical examples and expressions and outworkings of this posture and attitude. What does it look like? How do we apply it? How do we live it out? Emma kicked us off brilliantly last week by looking at having a longing heart, a heart that is longing for God, and how we see that expressed by prioritizing God's presence. If you weren't here and you didn't hear it, or if you just want to be reminded of it and perhaps spend more time on it, then head over to our YouTube channel and listen again, and the links are in our bulletin. And for each week of the series, make sure you're keeping up by listening again to any of those that you miss. And so this week we move on from a longing heart as we explore a consecrated heart. Psalm 4 in verse 3, it says, "Know that the Lord has set apart his faithful servant for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him." This psalm is linked to the same time as the psalm beforehand, Psalm 3. And we're told in that one that it's written around the time David is on the run from Absalom. Absalom was one of David's sons and wanted to be king and organizes a revolt against David. And so David flees from Jerusalem. And in this moment, David is declaring to Absalom and to Absalom's followers and to David himself, I think, that God has set him apart, that he is the rightful and chosen king. And this idea of being set apart is behind this word consecrated. Consecrated is one that we don't use that much in our everyday language. Debbie spoke in the summer on being consecrated. We can think of it as being set apart. In some ways, there's aspects of creating space, making room, being dependent on. When we think of it like that, we get a bit of an understanding on it, I think. We do that kind of stuff all the time in our own lives or in society. Think of things like a couple having a date night, or having a group of friends having a girls' night out. Perhaps in the new year, as people commit to New Year's resolutions, this setting apart, perhaps a time like an evening or a day or a season of setting apart a space. If you work from home, maybe you've created a specific room or area for work in order to create a boundary for you. Of setting apart a room for you to take part in a new hobby or a new routine. That idea of setting apart, of creating space, of being intentional is quite normal for us in a whole range of life situations that we go through. But throughout the Bible, the idea of being consecrated, of being set apart, is for God's glory, to worship God and to dedicate or depend on God. And what we also see is that often this is before we see God moving in an incredible way in the life of his people. In the Old Testament, we have God's people being told to consecrate their firstborns to God, and that's before God brings them out of a life of slavery in Egypt. In Joshua, the people are told to consecrate themselves, and that's before they go into the promised land. Again, they're told to consecrate themselves before God comes down into their presence. And so there is this moment of setting apart before these moments and times of God doing amazing things, of a time of the people of God going deeper in their relationship with him, or a deeper level of his presence. Into the New Testament, we don't have that word consecrate as much, but the theme is still there. We see it throughout the New Testament. In 1 Peter 2:9, followers of Jesus are regarded as being consecrated to God. Jesus has been set apart, consecrated for God. He has been made holy, and through him, his followers are also made holy and set apart for God. In Romans 12, it says, Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing and perfect will. Setting apart our whole lives as our worship to God, to serve God and to glorify him. So we see in consecration both preparation and separation, a preparing of our heart for God, preparing our whole lives, our body, our soul, our mind and our heart for God, and a separating of our heart from our own false desires and the world's false idols of sacrifice, and aligning it with God's heart. A consecrated heart is one that is dependent on God. It makes room for God. It creates space for God. It sets apart for God. It's distinct from those around it. I wonder what your heart is consecrated to. What is your heart set apart for? In David's life, we see this in different ways. One way picks up on what Emma shared last week as she spoke about David's tabernacle, how David prioritizes prayer and worship of God and the presence of God. And so they bring the ark of God back into the middle of the community. And when they do this, we read in 2 Samuel 6 how the ark is brought up and it's put on a cart and they can travel with it. And Uzzah touches it when the oxen stumbles and he's struck down. And then in 1 Chronicles 15, David realizes it's because the Levites were the ones who were meant to carry the ark. He says, we didn't inquire of him about how to do it in the prescribed way. So the priests and Levites consecrated themselves in order to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God with the poles on their shoulders, as Moses had commanded in accordance with the word of the Lord. David and God's people had neglected God's presence. They were just doing it the way they thought was best, or maybe the way those around them did it. But when they set themselves apart, prepared themselves and separated themselves, created a dependency on God, then they experienced the blessing of his presence and his holiness. Just over a week ago, I was at a citywide prayer retreat for local leaders, and it was that day set aside, a day where you just think, I could be getting so much more done with my day. But we were setting it aside for God. And in the space of a morning, there were 2 things that happened where I was, and then have continued in that way to be able to minister to people. At the beginning of that day, I was really thinking about how I didn't want to be there. But God does things when we set ourselves apart for him. Glenn Packham at New Wine this year made the point that often we are looking for carts. We're looking for easy answers of comfort, of security, of ease, or of the patterns of this world, as the Israelites were looking for a cart to carry God's presence. Often we are looking for carts, but God is looking for carriers. He keeps inviting us for a long journey. Because as the Israelites make this journey, now carrying the ark, they give praise and worship every 6 steps to Jerusalem. That's not a quick answer. Glenn Packham calls it sacrificial faithfulness. We can be so productive, so busy, so self-sufficient. It's easy not to be dependent on God, to be set apart for God. But consecration, this preparing and separating, returns us to holiness, which is not to be some shiny and on display thing, but holiness is usefulness to God. As God's people were made holy, not to be some shiny trophy or to sit in judgment over others, but to be a light to the nations, to draw the other nations into God's presence. A royal priesthood of all believers, not to be a shiny trophy or to sit in judgment over others, but to be a light to the nation. A city on a hill whose light goes out to the nations and draws them into the presence, love, and holiness of God. And so where do we see a consecrated heart attitude being expressed in the Bible, of setting apart for God? One of the expressions, I think, of this heart posture is through fasting. Fasting isn't a popular aspect of Christian discipleship, and yet we see it throughout the Bible. In Nehemiah 1, it says towards the end in a few verses into chapter 1, they said, "Those who have survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." In Daniel 10, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belshazzar. This message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3. In Matthew 6:16, Jesus says, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." It's like prayer, reading the scriptures, attending church, and giving, a normal part of Christian life. John Wesley considered fasting to be as normal and regular as all those other things. The ancient Christian texts show it to be the norm to fast until the early evening meal on Wednesday and Friday each week, twice a week, every week, to be fasting. There was a change to the Jewish practice of Mondays and Thursdays. Even in the setting apart, it was a distinct setting apart for these followers of Jesus. The passage in Matthew is in a section where Jesus talks about prayer and giving and fasting. And Jesus starts every one by saying, when you pray, when you give, when you fast. He assumes that we as his followers will do these things. He's not saying if you do these things, but when. You don't need to. It's all about grace, people. It's all feasting and no fasting. No, as a follower of Jesus, you will pray, you will fast, you will give money. And when you do, don't show off, be discreet, find the quiet place, build up an archive between you and God. Because there's a powerful temptation to look to be more spiritual than we are, more prayerful, more sacrificial, less selfish than we actually are. But we have to keep our hearts right. Don't worry about the outward appearance. Don't let our hearts become hard. Don't believe the hype. We're all sinners. We all have struggles. Our motives are always mixed. We're very likely to encounter fasting in the wider culture with its notable health benefits. Intermittent fasting is a hot topic and a hot word in the health world and the fitness world. And yet in modern Western Christianity it's been neglected. Even though the theologian Scott McKnight believes that fasting is the natural, inevitable response of a person to a serious or grievous moment in life. St. Basil the Great says, "Fasting gives birth to prophets. She strengthens the powerful. Fasting makes lawgivers wise. She is a safeguard for the soul, a steadfast companion for the body, a weapon for the brave, and a discipline for champions. Fasting repels temptations, anoints for godliness. She is a companion for sobriety, the crafter of a sound mind. In wars she fights bravely, in peace she teaches tranquility. What is fasting? In its most simple terms, it's going without food for a set amount of time. If we want to expand on that, we could say it's the practice of going without food or another stimulus for spiritual purposes for a set amount of time. That sounds like creating a dependency on God, a preparing of the heart and the body. How does fasting help us? A few thoughts on this. It helps us to offer ourselves to Jesus. It brings greater closeness and intimacy to God and all of ourselves. One of the reasons it's not popular is because we've become so disconnected from the land and from food and from our bodies. Fasting reconnects our discipleship and our whole life with God, to our whole lives, to our bodies, to being living sacrifices, of surrendering our whole selves. It's a powerful biblical countercultural act in this time. It helps us to grow in holiness, in that being set apart and consecrated to and for God. John Mark Comer says that when we fast, at least 4 things are happening in our body and soul. 1, it's weaning us off the pleasure principle. 2, it's revealing what's in our heart. 3, it's reordering our desires. And 4, it's drawing on the power of God to overcome sin. The third thing it helps us is to amplify our prayers. It releases miracles and overcomes resistance and enhances the power of prayer, brings a spiritual sharpness, and we see breakthrough. It shows that we are serious, we are hungrier for God than for our food. A few months ago, before a leadership planning day, we as a leadership team engaged in fasting in the week beforehand. And what came out of it was just so much sharpness to our prayers, breakthrough and hearing from God clearly. And it was just a really simple act of surrendering in that time, that preparation and separation. It helps us to understand and to stand with the poor. Does anything help us to remember the needs of our neighbours more? It's a way of bringing about biblical justice as we use the space created and the time to serve others. But within that, there is still mystery to it. We don't do it in force God's arm. We don't do it to say, well, we've done this, God, so you're going to answer our prayers. Sometimes we see those breakthroughs, sometimes we see those miracles, and sometimes we don't. None of this is out of pride, of feeling superior spiritually, or to deprive ourselves of joy, or to manipulate God into giving us what we want, or try. Illness, maybe a disaster, maybe an important season or moment, which may then have an outcome or a result that we were hoping for or we felt might come. But we don't engage in the fasting in order to get the result, but instead to press in, of stretching and growing, of sacrificial faithfulness, of setting ourselves apart. As we've mentioned a number of times, we're moving forward to next year being a year of prayer and worship for Mariners. And one aspect of this year is a year of prayer and fasting, with the vision and the hope that every day of next year there will be one person within Mariners who is set apart for the day for prayer and fasting in response to this important moment and year we feel God is placing on us. Do we expect there to be results and outcomes of this? Absolutely. Are we doing it so we get the results? No. But because it's the church's inevitable response to God's call to have consecrated hearts set apart for Him. There'll be more of this over the coming weeks as we look to the year ahead, but some top tips for fasting: start small. A complete fast for the entire day. Maybe it's starting with a partial fast of missing one meal, maybe the morning meal, maybe the daytime meal. But decide beforehand and stick to it. In the Bible, we see longer fasts, and people of faith have completed longer fasts. Don't start there if you've never fasted before. Work out what the next step is for you and decide beforehand. Stick to it. It might not just be food, but what things might show our priority for God. There's other stimuli in life. There's plenty of stimuli in life. It's not just food, and for some of us it might not be the right thing to be food. It might not be possible for us. We may have things that are stopping us. Maybe medication means that we can't give up food. It wouldn't be good for us, for our health, to give up food in that way, for a whole number of different reasons. Think about subtraction, not addition. We don't want to be adding something more in to our busy lives. The whole point is that we're subtracting, we are separating, we are being set apart. Remember that things might get worse before they get better. If this is your first time fasting, there might be a challenge to it. There might be not feeling like you've got much out of it, or it was just a really awful experience. But as we discipline ourselves, as we set apart ourselves for God, things may change the next time. We may experience something else the next time. It's about those next steps as we grow and stretch ourselves. Don't compare to others. These are our own journeys. Some people may be used to doing this. Some people's lives might really fit with being able to set apart the day for spending it entirely in prayer and in fasting. Others of us have jobs. Others of us have responsibilities and people relying on us. But what in your day can you set apart to make it different from every other day? And giving it to God. And so we're beginning to prepare ourselves as a community. Although this is someone each day, we're looking to make it as connected as possible. This is a community-wide thing, not an individual thing. So how we're expecting God will be speaking to us and doing things, and we'll be sharing how that will work as well. But how might it work for you if you're working, if you've got kids at home, if you can't give up food? Where's your starting point? What's the next step for you? Where's the stretching for you next year? And you know what? I'm not so concerned with the first day next year. What I want to know is, what's the last day of next year going to look like? Not what will the beginning of next year be like, but what will the end of next year be like? What will our community be like on the 31st of December 2024 if we consecrate our hearts through prayer and fasting? Maybe before we get there, though, God is placing that question to you today as you listen to this. Where are you creating dependency on God? What pockets of dependency is there in your week for God to show up? And how is your heart? Amen.